that too. But I keep going back to is something like the volatile or the excessive sacred, right? So we just kind of go in. So I've always been really fascinated by, and as much as you're essentially, there are these two moments that sit with me in the first chapter of that text. So the first moment is where Adorno, right, Adorno and Horkheimer are using, right, Odysseus, right, encounter Homer's Odysseus, the narrative where, the part of the narrative where Odysseus encounters the sirens or the sirens, however it's pronounced, right, where, right, in order for Odysseus' crew to actually get by the sirens, right, the workers, right, the workers have to put, wax their ears, right, Odysseus has to tie himself to the mast of the ship, right, so that Odysseus can actually hear the sirens, which these kind of winged creatures, somewhere between, human and animal or something like that, right? But the sounds are both, right, enticing, but also destructive, right? Because it entices you towards the rocks, and that's where the ship collapses, right? So this is often taken as some kind of metaphor for the division between, right, like a kind of, intellectual middle class and working class, right? Those who have to do some kind of intellectual work, kind of manual labor, and can't enjoy opera or something like that. And those who are able to enjoy high works of art, but have to do it at a certain kind of distance. I'm not quite as interested in that kind of division, right? But I am interested in how, right, Odysseus is a certain kind of travel narrative, right, that has me thinking about the oceanic, how that might be both, right, in line with, but also disrupted by thinking about the transatlantic slave trade and what Spillers calls the oceanic. The other moment in that chapter is when Adorno says, right, of course, Adorno, Horkheimer had this critique of progressive narratives, right, progress. Benjamin's language kills the dead twice, right, not only by creating these rank ordering peoples, but also by, turning suffering into a moment of celebration, right? Adorno and Horkheimer have this line that the urge to rescue the past is something living, instead of using it as a material of progress, has been satisfied only in art. That which does not seem to be useful for the advancement of progress, accumulation, coherent meanings, and so forth, right, somehow get taken up in art. Right after they say that, they say, well, there's a kind of compromise within a certain kind of enlightenment imagined, right? Art is okay, right? It can incorporate like contradiction, paradox, and so forth, as long as it's relegated to a kind of secondary form of knowledge, right? You might even see that there's some ways in which a certain kind of imagination is sacred, whether religious is also kind of there's all that. So I'm thinking about the aesthetic cry. I'm thinking about like a certain expressions of suffering within the context of the transatlantic slave trade, right? What Moten calls this kind of extended cry, right? Problematic ways goes through Hester, goes through, for him, I think, right, jazz, blues, and so forth, right? But I'm also trying to take seriously about how does Black aesthetic, Black music, and Black literary expressions of Black literary expressions of music, right? Both work within and against certain grammars of progress, again, grammars that kill the dead repeatedly, right? How does aesthetics both work within and against tendencies to turn suffering into a moment of celebration? There's that moment in the co-authored text by Frank Wilderson, The City of Heart, right? Where that's the moment of like, it's like, often, right, Black people in the academy are, do this really amazing work, right? There's almost this compulsion to turn, right, centuries of brutality into a moment, either a coherent proposal or into something that, we feel good about ourselves. So I'm thinking about Black aesthetics and literary expressions of Black aesthetics as this kind of site of ambivalence, where often there is a moment where it's taken up into a grammar of progress, but it might also undo and disrupt that as well. So let me just things and I'll be quiet, right? So one place that I'm interested in is kind of Du Bois's descriptions of the spirituals. Right? I imagine people look at me like, Du Bois again, right? Why begin? Yes, right. But I hope that by starting with Du Bois again, I'm also undoing, right? Some of Du Bois's maybe assumptions, but also the way in which Du Bois is taken. Right? So there's at the end of Souls of Black Folk, right? He has a chapter right on the sorrow songs. It actually was not. It was an editorial choice. It was not supposed to be the last chapter. The last, right, is kind of like we could call it almost Souls of Black is a kind of a mixtape, right, of different genres. But he says, he reminds the reader that, every chapter begins with, right, a line from the sorrow song, right, or notes, musical notes. Right? So he says, right, there's a kind of cry that precedes the thought. Right? right? So I'm kind of interested in what does it mean to think that cry, right? What does it mean to think that shriek that actually can't be brought into thought, right? And yet, right, like he does, right? Like so, but I'm right. But so, what does it mean to actually try to resist, right? The maybe a certain kind of grammatical or political or whatever, right, or a certain kind of discursive compulsion, right, to bring that cry into thought. Du Bois confesses in the chapter, ever since I was a child, these songs have stirred me strangely, right? To be stirred by, for instance, a sound, a vocal expression, or an instrument is to undergo a combination of stimulation, arousal, disturbance. It means to experience an altered state, to lose one's sense of coherence. Stirring indicates a capacity to move and be moved, right? To experience a figurative kind of twisting. The adverb strangely accentuates, right, the disturbance and introduces uncanniness into forms of agitation that the sorrow songs prompt. Perhaps because of Du Bois's upbringing in an austere Great Barrington community, these songs oscillated from sounding unfamiliar to feeling close and at home. This strange stirring is not too far from what Du Bois calls the frenzy, his description of Black religious practices. The frenzy for Du Bois alludes to church gatherings, right? Music inflected rituals that entail shouting, shrieking, murmuring, stomping, waving, weeping, and laughing. Similar to, right, Durkheim's understanding of the effervescent quality of sacred festivals. The frenzy connotes a moment of being beside and outside oneself, an ecstatic event that blurs the very distinction between interior and exterior. It is a way of being caught, right? Catching or being caught by the spirit. And even though Du Bois and Durkheim focus on the outward expressions of the wild demonic state, I'm also interested in the ways that these strange stirrings and frenzies relate to internal thoughts and reflections, how sorrow reconfigures how we might discuss and experience the interaction between thought and affect, or the conceptual and the emotional. Finally, the stirrings induced by the sorrow songs and Du Bois' emphasis on that affectability refuses what Denise de Silva calls the transparent eye. The image of the self-contained European subject defines itself through an opposition to affectable, racialized others. For Du Bois, the sorrow song upsets prevailing early 20th century accounts of the complacency and happiness of the enslaved, in opposition to those who would tell us that life was joyous, to the Black slave, careless and happy, and so forth. Du Bois contends that spirituals tell another, more complicated and terrifying story. They are, quote, the music of an unhappy, the music of an unhappy people, of the children of disappointment. They tell of death and suffering, unvoiced longing toward a truer world of misty wanderings, hidden ways. Sorrow, or the extended Black cry, tells us something about death and anguish under the regime of slavery. The genre is a witness to the violent foundations of colonial modernity in the U.S. sublimation state. Sorrow gives a voice or a sound to. It retains the painful details of these projects. This unhappy music, in response to kidnapping, war, forced labor, torture, sexual violence, and separation from kin, disappoints the kinds of narratives that would retrospectively diminish or explain away the anguish and protest of enslaved Blacks. By underscoring death, suffering, and discontent, Du Bois creates what Sarah Ahmed calls an unhappy archive. For Ahmed, happiness, among other things, is a form of world making. World making that makes the world cohere around proper objects, ideas, and values. This form of world making treats happiness as the end or telos of the good life, and treats unhappiness as an obstacle, that which gets in the way of a fulfilled life. We might say that this form of world making can be directed toward the past and the future. Du Bois's context, the discourse of the complacent and careless slave, is part of a project that attempts to fasten subjects to happy and affirmative narratives about freedom, progress, and civilization. It would be short-sighted, though, to only focus on sorrow as an aesthetic re-expression of death and disappointment. As the above quote indicates, Du Bois also describes the sorrow song in terms of unvoiced longings, hidden modes of being, and wandering in an unanticipatable manner. Here we might think of the concealed practices and rituals that enable that enable the slave's endurance, stealing away, surreptitious gatherings, using code words and secret language to plan an escape, general forms of dissimulation under systems of surveillance and confinement. At the same time, the notion of wandering, as Sarah Cervenak points out, can refer to fantasies, daydreams, meditations, forms of actual and imaginary roaming that appear wayward to the master, the self-contained subject, and the will to keep things in line. These qualities of sorrow that are not reducible to death and suffering lead to Du Bois' claim that through all the sorrow songs there breathes the hope of faith in the ultimate justice of things. The minor cadences of despair change often to triumph and calm confidence. Du Bois claims that he often hears in spirituals a transition from despair to triumph and confidence. This transition could signify or anticipate a complete shift from anguish, or what Bataille calls a rupture that leaves one at the limit of tears, to a state of coherence and stability. It could, in other words, sound like a movement from pain and burden to the appearance and performance of wholeness and plenitude. Yet one could also read the term change as an in-between state, a suspension a fraught interval and interplay between anguish and exaltation, even as the cadences of victory can make enduring pain difficult to register. Du Bois suggests by his use of the preposition through, that the hope is not acquired easily or unequivocally. Sorrow requires one to make a passage through the moan and the violent conditions and arrangements that the cry expresses. A strange sense of possibility is made available by being worked on by the cry. Thinking with Sean Crawley's work on Blackness Pentecostal breath, we might think of the breath of hope as a kind of aspiration that is ensconced in the sigh, choke, gasp. According to Du Bois, the aspirational / hope is a split that takes different directions. As he puts it, sometimes it's a faith in life, sometimes a faith in death, sometimes assurance of boundless justice and some fair world beyond. Allusion to a fair world beyond points to Black people's commitment to a God of right, according to Du Bois, to the Exodus narrative, the image of Jordan as both an earthly and divine space that exists on the other side of enslavement and torment. As Eddie Glaude points out, the Hebrew Bible's account of God identifying with the suffering of the Israelites and rescuing them from the tyranny of Pharaoh was taken up by antebellum Blacks, allowing Black to inscribe themselves into a meta story of deliverance, redemption. For Glaude, Exodus created a sense of commonality and shared obligations among 19th century Black folk, primarily provided a grammar to make sense of present injustices and give shape to the future aspirations of freedom. But this is not all that it did. Exodus paradigm, Sylvester Johnson points out, also annexed Black people to settler colonial projects, the justification of the ongoing displacement and removal of indigenous peoples, and imperial pursuits of war and expansion. For Johnson, similar to Edward Said, there is no promised land without the displacement and destruction of those who occupy the space, the Canaanites. In addition to boundless justice, Du Bois claims that spirituals also attach hope to life and death, as if life and death are interrelated sources of inspiration apart from somewhere fair world beyond. Here, Du Bois prompts the reader to think through the fraught intimacy between life and death, especially for the Black slave and her descendants. The life and preservation of the racial capitalist order, for instance, relies on Black death and suffering, on rendering Black communities vulnerable to violence, state surveillance, indigence, imprisonment. In response to life being a social death sentence for the slave, Du Bois points to a legacy of considering death as a kind of liberation from this predicament, a legacy that includes kidnapped Africans flying home, slave ships or captive mothers killing children to rescue them from a life of gratuitous violence, while flying home or infanticide accomplishes liberation from social death, or the death that defines Black life, a condition of being the living dead. Slave songs and spirituals suggest that there is a life that exceeds while being traversed by death. More specifically, songs give a sound to and keep alive and re-express experiences of torment and loss. Through dance, song, and surreptitious gathering, slaves did not necessarily surmount or overcome a series of ruptures, dislocations, and losses. As Saidiya Hartman points out, slaves performed and re-articulated these ruptures in spaces and meeting places characterized by ecstasy and danger, transcendence, and potential punishment. In other words, the life that remains and survives Black spiritual practices, including slave gatherings and bush arbor meetings, is haunted and beleaguered. Okay, all right, so what does this all have to do with singers? So let me just say this, and then let talk about these things. So I'm really interested in sorrow connected to like spirituals. I'm interested in the ways in which someone like Zora Neale Hurston and others pushed back against Du Bois and said, reducing the sorrow song with the spirituals to sorrow, tragic, right? But I think that there's something about sorrow, right, that for me brings together what Frederick Douglass would call a kind of ineffable sadness with an ineffable joy, right? I'm just trying to think that in terms of certain authors within religious studies like George Bataille, we're thinking about the sacred in terms of a kind of ecstatic quality, right? That is both overwhelming, that's disruptive, it's disruptive, right? It's disruptive, it's a rupturing, but it's also associated with a certain kind of, a certain kind of joy and enjoyment. I'm trying to think about that in terms of Black aesthetics, but also maybe the limits of that when thinking about the kind of everyday forms of violence that decimation, right, that organize the world, right? And then finally, I'll just leave us with a couple questions, right? What does it mean to affirm Black art and Black music at a moment when so many strands of Black music have been incorporated into a U.S. imperial machine as part of its musical canon, right? We were talking about canons earlier, right? For someone like Toni Morrison, there's a connection between canon and canon, right? C-A-N-N-O-N, right? There's a connection between canon building, right, and empire building, right? So what does it mean to, right, when, jazz is seen as U.S. classical music, right? And then the last question I want to leave us with is a question I've been reading some Larry Neal recently, Black aesthetics, a lot of problems in these texts, but there's a couple of questions that continue to stay with me, right? One is the connection between art and aesthetics. Aesthetics and ethics, right? And one is a question, right, that he asked in the content of the 1960s. What is the function of art, right, in this present moment of genocide, imperial war, and ecological disaster? Thank you.